One thing that surprised me about the article I didn't know, it was the part about the lawmaker and how he was trying to pass this law against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, but he was pressured to include gender identity, and so it didn't pass. And this was 13 years before another law that did pass. So it's just very clear example of how the forced teaming like negatively affects our rights and our protections.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the LGB Alliance USA News Roundup for November 3rd, 2025. We are here with Joss, Jose, and me, Arianne. First, a summary of the news. A lawsuit is filed against U.S. fencing over its policy allowing males to compete as women. The University of California system is allegedly requiring affirmation of gender identity for its harassment training. California Governor Newsom advocates for clearer rules on trans participation in sports. The Texas Supreme Court decides that judges can opt on religious grounds to only officiate heterosexual weddings if they choose. NPR reports that the Trump administration is about to release rules restricting federal funding for pediatric transition. And the Wall Street Journal quotes volunteers from LGB Alliance USA and LGB Alliance Colombia in a new article about the LGB and TQ plus divide. We'll begin with you, Joss.
Thanks, Arianne. Starting off with some fencing news. U.S. Olympic fencer Margarita Guzzi Vincenti, along with Emma Griffin and Patricia Hughes, have filed a class action lawsuit against USA Fencing, alleging the organization violated Title IX by allowing a male to compete in the women's event. The lawsuit centers on an incident at the 2025 North American Cup in Minneapolis, where the plaintiffs claim USA Fencing permitted a trans-identified male athlete to participate in the women's saber competition without meeting the organization's stated eligibility requirements. The plaintiffs argue that USA Fencing failed to enforce its own policy requiring trans-identified males to maintain testosterone levels below a specific threshold for at least 1 year prior to competition. The complaint alleges that this decision compromised both the fairness and safety of the event. One of the plaintiffs reportedly sustained an injury during a bout with a male athlete, which they claim could have been avoided had USA Fencing adhered to its own guidelines. The lawsuit also accuses the organization of retaliating against athletes who voiced concerns, including threats of suspension and removal from national teams. The plaintiffs are seeking damages and policy reforms, arguing that USA Fencing's actions violate federal protections under Title IX and fail to uphold its duty to safeguard athletes. At this point, you may be wondering how these athletes have a Title IX complaint against USA Fencing. Well, in 2020 and 2021, USA Fencing listed itself as an educational service organization on its applications for Paycheck Protection Program loan, or better known as a PPP loan. Vincenti, Griffin, and Hughes all mentioned fairness and safety as primary reasons why they are plaintiffs in this case. I'll leave you with this quote from Emma Griffin. She said, quote, "We pay entry fees, travel across the country, and commit years to training. We deserve to know the rules and trust that women's events are truly women's events. It's about respect for athletes and transparency from the organizations that govern our sport." End quote. Moving now to news from California. In news shared by Amy Reichert, FIRE, short for the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, and the California Family Council, California universities are enforcing mandatory harassment prevention training that critics say compels students to affirm transgender ideology or risk losing access to their education. Under the 2024 state law, AB 2608, students must complete annual sexual harassment and discrimination training using updated definitions. The University of California system's version is called SHAPE, short for Sexual Harassment, Anti-Discrimination, Prevention, and Education. It requires students to answer questions in line with the belief that, quote-unquote misgendering or opposing trans-identified individuals' access to single-sex spaces like restrooms constitutes harassment. Failure to pass the training with a perfect score results in a registration hold, preventing students from enrolling in classes. The SHAPE curriculum defines harassment broadly, including the creation of a hostile environment based on gender identity or expression. A sample question from the training shared by Young Americans Foundation presents a scenario in which a trans-identified student is misgendered and dead-named. The only acceptable answer is that the behavior constitutes a hostile environment. Critics argue that the program redefines harassment to target students who hold religious or biological beliefs about sex and gender, effectively turning a harassment prevention initiative into an ideological compliance test. They claim that respectful disagreement is now treated as discriminatory, and that universities are conditioning students to adopt a politicized definition of the truth. The training is mandatory across UC campuses, including UCLA, UC Berkeley, UC San Diego, and UC Irvine, among others, and was developed in partnership with the UC Office of Civil Rights. While campuses are not required to use SHAPE specifically, all must implement a program that aligns with the law's definitions. And now I'll hand it to Arianne for more news out of California.
Thank you, Joss. On October 24th, California Governor Gavin Newsom said that the state needs to create clearer rules on trans inclusion in women and girls sports. These remarks come in the aftermath of his March interview with the late conservative podcaster Charlie Kirk, in which he expressed concerns about the fairness of the participation of trans-identified males on women and girls sports teams. Newsom appears to be echoing those opinions in his more recent KQED remarks. He said, quote, "I disagree with all the vitriol, but I agree with the issue of fairness in that respect, that it's unfair in these circumstances and I haven't been able to reconcile it," unquote. Now, KQED noted that Newsom has a trans godson. He also inherited legislation signed into law by previous Democratic Governor Jerry Brown in 2013 that allowed people to participate in school sports according to their gender identity rather than biological sex. Not to mention a 2005 law signed by Republican Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger allowing males to identify into women's spaces. But Newsom is faced with lawsuits from a hostile Trump administration saying his state's policies allowing males on female school sports teams violates Title IX. Plus, he's faced with the reality that sex-segregated sports teams are politically popular, while his state and party's trans-inclusive athletic team policies are not. The wheels are clearly spinning in the governor's head, and not a moment too soon for his 2028 presidential ambitions. As he said, quote, "It was an experience for me, born over the actual application and responsibility as governor to try to figure this out, and I couldn't. And maybe other people can, but I haven't been able to figure it out," unquote. Indeed, I don't get any sense that he has figured it out. It sounds like he wants some advisors to gift him with some easy exit on this issue, some magical incantation that will appease both his TQ plus base and women's sports advocates. But there is no magical incantation for resolving sports disputes. Sports is about physical athleticism, about bodies, about biological reality. If you don't draw your lines based on biology, you aren't left with much of a workable solution. And Newsom is probably too afraid to admit that, so he wants to pass the buck to someone else. But will his political opponents let him get away with this under the limelight of national politics? I wouldn't be so sure, especially given that Kamala Harris didn't get away with it in 2024. If Kamala Harris was tarnished because she stood for they, them, not you, Governor Newsom, whose pro-gender ideology track record is, if anything, greater than Harris's, is going to run for president with an albatross around his shoulder. And now moving on to Texas news. On October 24th, the Texas Supreme Court laid down a rule that allows for judges to opt out of performing same-sex marriages on religious grounds. This rule is a clarification of Canon 4 of the Texas Code of Judicial Conduct, which prevents judges from doing anything that would imperil their impartiality. As some background on this case, Canon 4 was previously used to rule that Waco Justice of the Peace Diane Hensley violated impartiality when she refused to marry same-sex couples. Initially, Hensley followed the precedent set by the Obergefell ruling in 2025, which required her to either marry both gay and straight couples or not officiate weddings at all. Judges in Texas are not required to officiate weddings. They are only allowed to. So Hensley initially decided not to officiate any weddings, but then she changed course and decided to perform opposite-sex marriages, but not same-sex marriages in 2016. She discussed her decision publicly in 2019 with the Waco Herald Tribune, and the Judicial Conduct Commission reprimanded her after they found out and investigated. She sued on religious freedom grounds, and her case went through a variety of courts. Then in 2020, Jack County Judge Brian Umpress sued because he too wanted to only marry heterosexual couples on religious grounds and was worried the Hensley case would get him into trouble for doing so. The Umpress case also went through the courts, resulting in a federal appeals court asking the Texas Supreme Court to weigh in. And that's why the Texas Supreme Court issued this amendment clarifying that he and other officials would not be disciplined for only marrying straight couples. Chief Justice Jimmy Blacklock pointed out that Hensley referred same-sex couples to people who were willing to perform gay marriages, and that no same-sex couples complained about Hensley's impartiality. So what are the implications of this for LGB people concerned about same-sex marriage? Well, like I said before, there is so far no evidence that same-sex couples have had difficulties finding officials willing to marry them on religious grounds in Texas. Furthermore, even before this rule change, officials who objected to same-sex marriage were already allowed to opt out of officiating marriages entirely, since officiating marriages was optional for judges to begin with. So it's not clear this is going to have much impact on same-sex couples' ease of obtaining marriage licenses in Texas. However, if it does become increasingly normalized for officials to refuse to marry same-sex couples, could this become a problem for gay and lesbian couples in more conservative, perhaps more rural areas where there are fewer options available? If it becomes far easier for straight couples in some jurisdictions to obtain marriage licenses than gay couples, could this be a problem where the impartiality of the justice system is imperiled in these jurisdictions? If so, we will likely see more lawsuits from aggrieved same-sex couples incoming. We'll keep you posted. And now for some national news. On October 30th, NPR announced that they obtained the leaked draft of a proposed rule that would prohibit federal Medicaid reimbursements for gender medicalization treatments for patients under 18. It would also prohibit CHIP, or the Children's Health Insurance Program, from reimbursing gender medicalization for patients under 19. Another proposed rule would block Medicaid and Medicare funding for any hospital service that offers pediatric gender transition. Last July, the National Review published an article saying that these rule changes were submitted and were undergoing regulatory review. NPR's recent reporting appears to validate that earlier National Review report. These rules are slated for release in early November if NPR sources are correct. And we'll keep you updated if and when those rule changes are finally released, which should be any day now. The Wall Street Journal is on a roll with its coverage of gender identity. On October 29th, Colin Wright published an article for the Wall Street Journal defending the hypothesis that social contagion plays a role in the increase of transgender identities. And on October 31st, the Wall Street Journal published an article by Pamela Paul called The Growing Divide in the Rainbow Coalition. The article features interviews with gay and lesbian activists who advocate for a split between the LGB and TQ+, as well as LGB and the trans-identifying people opposed to the split or who wish to seek compromise. There was a wide spectrum of views covered. Some of the quotes are from people we have interviewed before, like Anne Menashe from Feminists in Struggle, who was fired from her job due to gender-critical views, as well as artist and writer Nevelyn, who made one of the earliest popular YouTube videos criticizing the excesses of trans activism. Ben Appel, whose book Cis White Gay, The Making of a Gender Heretic is coming out soon, is also featured prominently in the article. I was one of the interviewees, and when asked about the problems associated with allowing trans-identifying people to change their legal documentation, I said, quote, "You can't undo the fact of how you were born or that you're male or female. It would be much harder to enforce single-sex spaces for women if you have no documentation to back it up," unquote. The article also quoted Jose, who we have here today. He has volunteered with us. He also is one of the co-founders of LGB Alliance Colombia. So, Jose, I just want to hand it over to you. What was it like being interviewed for the Wall Street Journal, and how do you think of your story coming out like that?
Thanks, Arianne. It was a little scary. I was very anxious before the story got published. And I remember I kept refreshing like the Wall Street Journal's website or Pamela Paul's website. I kept refreshing to see if it had been published already. And when it did, and I read it, I was just so relieved and so happy that, you know, our stories were out there and the message was clear, and it really was focused just on how it, how it affects us. It wasn't like against any community or, so I was very happy with the article and what I was able to, put out there, my story. I figured when I was talking to Pamela, I was referred to her by Glenna Goldis, our favorite lesbian lawyer. And I figured if she had already talked to Glenna, who's so articulate and, she's so good at explaining this issue, like I thought to myself, well, what does she want to hear from me? I'm just like a regular person. But then I thought, oh, she just wants to hear from regular gay people. So that was kind of what I kept telling myself when I talked to Pamela, even though I was super nervous and I felt like I spoke really fast during our conversation. But I kept telling myself she just wants to know my story. Like I'm a regular person who's been affected by this ideology. And I explained to her how, yeah, I mean, there were some powerful things that I think I told her that were kept out of the piece, but it's okay. I know she had a, space constraint and all that. So but overall, I'm very happy. Yes.
If I can ask, Jose, what were some of those things that didn't get included in the article that you would want to have shared here?
Sure. So I went into detail about some of my like peaking stories. For example, when I won that LGBT scholarship, I was paired with a mentor who was supposed to like guide me and in the whole like university, how to met, college, like all that was new for me, how to have a career, all that. But they paired me with trans-identified female. And I don't know if she called herself a gay man or not, but we had a few phone calls and I just couldn't relate to her at all. And I explained to Pamela that looking back, it's because, her identity was grounded in all those stereotypes that I had been oppressed by. So, I'm not surprised that we didn't connect. But stories like that, how it just didn't make sense to me. the whole ideology.
Wow, that's an interesting anecdote because I mean you had a really great story in that article about how like you came to the US and how you saw all this queer madness and that particular anecdote that you actually there was a trans-identified female you were paired with for an LGBT scholarship. Wow. Yeah, I there were many things I remember talking about with Pamela Paul, and I thought it was interesting that the one that was selected was about documentation. You know, what do we do about documentation for sex versus gender? Like, should transgender people be allowed to have their gender identity on board? Because that was actually the question that she asked that I was most taken off guard by because it's actually not something we've talked a whole lot about here at LGB Alliance. So I'm just curious, Jose, did you have moments like that in the interview where you're like, oh, I don't know how to answer that question, or whoa, what an interesting angle to be asked about?
Yeah, she asked me about passports, like what I thought, my thoughts on passports, and I was like, and then she was like, if their gender should be on the passport, and I was like, well, you don't have a right to falsify your sex on like your legal documents. I think that was like my answer. But yeah, some questions that I was like, well, like policy. I think those questions about policy, I wasn't really prepared for.
Yeah, and I get the impression too that she was really trying to look for people under 40. She wanted to find more young voices, and I appreciate that because it does seem like there's this narrative that you often hear about, oh, it's just the old-timey, old-fashioned LGB, people who are, just stubbornly not getting with the kids program. And I think we have to recognize that there are young people who are also speaking out. I think it can be harder for young people to speak out because of our peer groups and because of social media breathing down our throats about, what we can and can't say. But I really appreciate that this article did highlight a lot of younger people and younger people speaking about what they did in college. I know, you had a story like that. I guess Ben Appel, who was featured prominently, also had a story like that. So I appreciated that.
People have asked me, since the article was published, like, why aren't there more, like, why do I not know more young people like you or who think like you? And I tell them, well, I'm the example of what happens when you do speak out, the price that you pay. So there are no incentives to do so. Like you lose your friends, you lose relationships, your livelihood can be affected. So young people are more vulnerable in that way, and it's just really no surprise that it's mostly the older people.
And there's less to risk, I think, with some of the older crew that are speaking out. Do you feel like you being featured in this article maybe will open the door for more younger people to take the step forward and use their voice too to speak out?
That's certainly what I hope happens. I know that I've been inspired by so many like LGB people, not just in the US, but in the UK. So I hope that if I was inspired by them, they can be inspired by me. I think that's kind of how this works. We see other people speak up, and then we find the courage to do so ourselves.
I like how you put that, Jose. I think that's really brilliant. That it's about courage, about finding courage. And if this article has done anything like really monumental for the LGB movement, I think it is just emboldening people to see there's a whole diversity of people out here that are speaking out. We're lesbian, gay, bisexual, and we're not trying to have any kind of intermingling anymore. We're finding our way free of the force teaming. It's LGB. We have unique experiences that need to be focused on, and we're here to do that. So I'm really grateful that you are an outspoken voice and for all the people who speak out and use their voice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also kind of I thought it was good that this article tried to present other sides, if for no other reason that it sort of exposed some of the absurdities with the other side. There's this one quote that so many people in my sort of gender critical social groups have been face palming all over the place, which was a quote by Kathy Renna, who's the communications director for the National LGBTQ Task Force, who says, "For those of us who work in this field as advocacy-focused political activists, these are hard conversations we have to have as a movement. To me, this is often about fear of the other, and no one understands that better than queer people." And when asked to respond to gay people who don't believe in gender identity, Renna says, "It's fine not to believe in it, but why do you have to impose what you believe on everyone else?" And I think that's hilarious because it just goes to show the amount of projection activists like that are engaged in. We're the ones that are saying, no, don't impose your beliefs on us. Don't impose your pronouns and demands for gender identity on us.
But I like the point that you make, Ariane, that it highlights the absurdity also. I noticed exactly the same thing when I read it. I was just kind of gobsmacked. Like, how is this even a quote that spilled out of this person's mouth that we're the ones. We're the ones. Get out of here.
I wanted to say that one thing that surprised me about the article I didn't know, it was the part about the lawmaker and how he was trying to pass this law against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, but he was pressured to include gender identity, and so it didn't pass. And this was 13 years before another law that did pass. So it's just very clear example of how the forced teaming like negatively affects our rights and our protections. And also, I already loved John Boyne before I found out he was like sex realist or gender critical. So, one of his books was very important to me. It was a gay novel about two soldiers in World War I. It's called The Absolutist. And I read it as a teenager and oh my God, I became obsessed with it. So to see my name on an article, compared to him, where like we're in the same team, I don't know, it was just a great moment for me.
That's really cool about John Boyne. I actually had a similar reaction when the politician you're talking about, Barney Frank. I had long known about him for other issues he was involved in, and I was pleasantly surprised that he at least was willing to acknowledge some dissension from within gay ranks on the issue. I get the impression he's more on team, let's try to work it out and have a compromise on it, which, I don't know how possible that's going to be. But I was really struck by that point in the interview. And I think when Pamela Paul was talking to me, I think I remember her bringing up a gay politician and wondering if that was Barney Frank she was talking about. So yeah, I was struck by that part of the interview, the article as well, and that makes me also kind of now want to check out John Boyne. I'm not so familiar with his work. That sounds very cool.
And he was the author who, because he was nominated, that all the trans activists, for anybody who's not aware, right, that they just like said no award for this year rather than have to deal with him and the fact that he's a gender critical gay man. Barney Frank is in his 80s. I think part of Barney Frank's issue is that he's much older and towing the party line. He was one of the most liberal Democrats in Congress, but some people that are on the super liberal left are just kind of out of touch with what's happening for the youth in particular. There's a big divide between somebody that's in their 80s and somebody that's in their 20s and their experience of being gay in America right now.
And that sort of goes back to what we were saying earlier, that oftentimes it's easier for older people to, go on the record with these things. And once again, really want to emphasize, there are younger people out there who think like we do, who think like, Jose does and how I do, and I really do hope that this article provides some perspective, particularly for younger LGB people who are afraid of speaking out, that, you can do it, and there are people who agree with you.
I love how you sum that up. And I want to thank you again, Jose, for making time today to talk with us and to share your experience.
My pleasure. Thank you both.
On that note, thank you for joining us. We hope to see you again next time. Remember to like and subscribe.